guys. Well, now's as good a time as any to get to our guest tonight. We have a treat for our listeners. He's an ESPN senior writer, but man, he's really all over the place. He writes for ESPN.com. I see him down here in Charlotte when he fills in on the Paul Feinbaum show. I saw that he wrote and contributed to Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s book, Racing to the Finish. Got a radio show with Marty Smith, Marty McGee. That's Saturday mornings on ESPN Radio. And you guys got a new show coming that's going to be airing on the SEC Network, Marty and McGee Talking Season, with all the football coaches from the SEC. Ryan, what don't you do?
Well, listen, you know the deal, young man. If you don't say no, say, would you like to do so-and-so, the answer is always yes, because if you say no, then someone else might say yes, and then they won't call anymore. So, no,
yes, sir.
I'm really, really fortunate that I get to do a lot of different things, and particularly getting to work with my buddy Marty, who's been a friend of mine for almost 20 years now. And, yeah, we're excited. We're going to be doing a lot of TV this fall on SEC Network, and this talking season, these coaches specials kind of kicked that off, and we are as surprised as anyone that anyone would let us just sit there and talk. And, we managed to break down barriers, and we're rednecks on ESPN, so we'll take whatever we can get.
Weren't you the original redneck at ESPN?
Yeah, I was. In fact, I tell the story all the time. The reason I became the NASCAR guy, I started at ESPN right out of college as a production assistant back in 1994, and I always tell Jeff Gordon that I owe him everything because my first week on the job, he won the inaugural Brickyard 400.
Wow.
And suddenly NASCAR was cool in the building. And at ESPN almost 25 years ago, there were only two Southerners in the entire company. It was me and Reese Davis.
Really?
He was from Alabama and I was from North Carolina. And when they found out I was from Rockingham, they were like, well, you know a lot about NASCAR, right? And I'm like, yeah, and I don't think I knew as much as they thought I did, but I knew way more than they did. So it worked.
So with NASCAR, as I don't really watch it that much, what's something that goes into like a NASCAR event or a race, like some nuances that I wouldn't notice just as a casual watcher?
Well, it's just there's so much more to it. You know, you always just kind of roll your eyes when somebody says just go fast and turn left or whatever. But you go to a race shop, and I think people assume that all the racing team headquarters here in the Charlotte area are like, you know, the barn in Days of Thunder. And the reality is that they're clean rooms. I mean, they look like what you see when you're watching a documentary about NASA building satellites. And there are literally rocket scientists that work on these race cars. And so there's so much more to it than that. And plus, just the enormity of the event. You know, any regular old Sunday afternoon, Cup Series race, whether it's at Dover or Daytona or wherever, it feels like a gigantic college football game. I mean, there's Air Force flyovers, and there's thousands of people, and the logistics of how they pull it off, and the facilities are so big, even the small places. So that's it's funny, like Bristol Motor Speedway, which is one of the smallest facilities, racetrack-wise, that NASCAR runs on. You know, when they had the Virginia Tech-Tennessee game there just a couple years ago, it set the all-time attendance record for a college football game, and physically, that's one of the smallest facilities NASCAR runs on. So every event just feels giant. I always tell everybody, even if you don't care a thing about it, you should go just to get a sense of how big every single one of those races is.
What do you think, Ryan, was the turning point in NASCAR to become really it's one of the top four sports, I think. I think it's past NHL hockey in America. So it's one of those team sports where, fans latch onto their favorite racer. Like you said, it's got the big stadium atmosphere. What do you think was the one event maybe that put it into that echelon?
Well, I think I go back to when Jeff Gordon won the Brickyard 400. It was the first time that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which is my single most favorite sporting venue in the world, when it finally hosted a non-IndyCar race, when it hosted a stock car race, and there were 300,000 people there. And Jeff Gordon, who was born in Northern California and grew up in Indiana, and when he won, he's young and good-looking, and most of the guys look like Dale Earnhardt, who was a friend of mine. But Dale Earnhardt was in his 40s and had a mustache and was redneck, and Jeff Gordon was none of that. And so I really felt like that was kind of the breakthrough because it introduced basically the whole left side of the country, into NASCAR. And so, yeah, that's when the boom started. And it stayed there. I mean, that sport grew at a breakneck speed for 20 years, and it's struggling a little bit now because I think that we got a millennial on the line here, but millennials don't really care that much about cars. And, my daughter has babysitters, and I have college-age babysitters that I have to drive home because cars aren't a thing. And so NASCAR struggles a little bit right now with what the future is going to look like, but there's no question to me that it really started that summer of 1994 is when the boom time started.
Speaking of millennials, one of the maybe the future of NASCAR, maybe one of the guys that he recently won a race, Eric Jones. He's actually from our neck of the woods where we grew up there in Corona. He's from a town right near Corona, so that's kind of cool to have that local connection. But I've seen him talk about that he grew up racing all over the place. But there's a speedway, just a little dirt track in our hometown. It's called the Wasso Speedway.
The Big
where
O.
a lot of people go. There's the guys, the weekend warriors that takes their cars out there and stuff like that. And it's cool to hear a guy like Eric Jones talk about Wasso Speedway and how that's kind of where he got his roots going. And you hear Tony Stewart, he still loves to race on tracks like that. What's different about racing on those hometown tracks, those dirt tracks, than racing at a place like Bristol Motor Speedway or MIS?
Yeah, well, I tell people all the time, it's like I'm a big minor league baseball guy. My next minor league ballpark will be my 100th minor league ballpark. I just love going, and that's the difference. The difference is you're closer to it. It's homier. They're younger. You kind of have that same mix on the field at a minor league baseball game that you have, if you go to a Saturday night short track somewhere, which is you got the old guys like Crash Davis that are at the end of their career, and you got the young guys like Eric Jones just a couple of years ago that are teenagers, on the way up in their career. But it's the difference between going to a Detroit Tigers game and going to a Lansing Lugnuts game. You feel like you're kind of in on something on the ground floor when you go to a short track. And I don't think people who are hardcore race fans know this, but I don't think just general sports fans understand, no matter where you are in the country, you're probably a pretty short drive away from a Saturday night, summertime short track. And that's where all these guys get started. I mean, listen, Chase Elliott, who just won his first Cup Series race, the son of Bill Elliott, of course, the NASCAR legend, I've been watching Chase race since he was about 10 years old. And on the smallest tracks that you've never heard of, little dirt tracks around the Carolinas, and now, he's a winner in the Cup Series. So that's like any other sport. It's just the difference is you don't play Pop Warner football if you're Jeff Gordon. You race quarter midgets when you're 8 or 9 years old, which is what his kids are doing now.
So here's a great question, Ryan. So you've worked with both, according to your Wikipedia page, big-time researcher here, but according to your Wikipedia page, you had Paul Newman narrated one of your documentaries, and as we know, you've worked on a Paul Feinbaum show. So which Paul do you like more?
I think that Paul Feinbaum would not argue with me about this, but Paul Newman's the coolest dude I've ever been in the room with in my life. I worked at NASCAR Media Group, which I always describe it as NFL films with race cars. I worked there for a couple of years, and one of the big projects we worked on was a documentary film titled Dale. And Paul Newman owned an IndyCar team forever, was famous for driving around, the rich suburbs of Connecticut in a Volvo station wagon that he had like a Ford Cosworth IndyCar engine dropped into. And so he was a racing guy. He raced sports cars forever. And, of course, starred in the movie Winning. I mean, he was a racing guy. And so when we went to Paul Newman, I approached him through his IndyCar team and wanted to know if he would be interested. And he had been friends with Dale Earnhardt. And so he agreed to do it. And, in fact, for free, the money that we had budgeted to pay Paul Newman or whoever the narrator would be, Paul Newman just wanted us to donate that to his Newman's own charities. So yeah, that was an intimidating experience, I tell you that. But it was awesome. It turned out to be his last kind of big feature film project.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, we're talking NASCAR, and I'll tell you what, this is the most we've ever talked about it.
I appreciate that.
And I have some more interest about it too.
Yeah, well, good. Well, then I've done my job.
Absolutely.
I agree, and maybe it's bad, but the only thing I know about Paul Newman is how much people respect him as a NASCAR driver. But to be honest, the thing that I know him most for is just I think he voiced like a car in a Pixar movie.
Yeah, well, it's funny too. So I went out to Pixar. He was in Cars, the original Cars movie, and I was out at Pixar before Cars 3 came out in theaters a year ago, and I was arguing with those guys because they claim that they were the last feature film that Paul Newman worked on, and I told them, I said, nope, I said, our documentary we did was the last one he worked on. And so we were having a fun debate about that.
Speaking of movies, where do you rank Talladega Nights?
Oh, I love it. You know, and it's funny, too, because people in the NASCAR world get so oversensitive about how they're portrayed on the silver screen. And I mentioned the barn in Days of Thunder. You know, legend has it, it's not a legend, it's a fact, when they had the big premiere of Days of Thunder in Charlotte in 1990, people got up and walked out as soon as the movie started because one of the first scenes in the movie was this barn, and the font, the graphic that came up said Charlotte, North Carolina, and those guys were in there working on a race car. And the NASCAR people were so offended by that. Well, the Talladega Nights premiere in the 90s, I was working at NASCAR Media Group, and I was in a theater that was full of nothing but NASCAR employees, including the president of NASCAR, Mike Helton, who was a notoriously stone-faced guy. And he was sitting he's a huge dude. He was sitting in the middle of the theater, and my wife and I are just dying, cracking up, watching this movie, and no one else would laugh because they were all afraid they would offend Mike Helton. And then finally, Mike Helton busted out laughing when it got to the part where Ricky Bobby's wife announces, she goes, "I do not work. You know, I'm a race car driver's wife." That's such an inside joke, you know, but it's so true. But yeah, I like it. I got no problem with, but some of the people in the sport get a little sensitive about how they're portrayed. But I think it's awesome.
Yeah, well, obviously a parody, and then you got to thicken up that skin just a little bit, right?
Yeah, and it's funny how it's like the program, right? The college football film,
right?
That came out around the same time Days of Thunder came out. People in college football are just so deeply offended. I'm like, guys. This is a movie with James Caan. It's basically a cartoon. Just you know, enjoy it and be glad that the sport's getting a little attention.
Well, Ryan, you talked about the size of some of these NASCAR stadiums or the tracks, and Jared a couple weeks ago, he went to a country festival at MIS in Michigan, Faster Horses. I don't know if you've heard of that. Yeah, and we were talking about it on one of the last podcasts, and he was talking about how big the stadium was and everything like that. And I grew up going to MIS back when the capacity was 125,000.
Yeah.
That's all I was telling him, that the grandstands used to go basically around that whole 2-mile track. I don't know, why have things changed? Is it just that millennials aren't into the racing, or do you think it's that, you know, people are following NFL and NBA more?
Well, it's a lot of things, and, you know, Marty and I kind of half joke that we'd like to do a 30 for 30, like what happened to motorsports. And it's not just NASCAR, it's Formula One, it's everything's taking a dip. But I think that there's a lot of reasons. I mean, listen, when the economic crash happened in 2008, no sport was hurt worse than NASCAR. And the reason is because, as you guys know, it's a sponsorship-based, you know, financial system. Yeah. Just how the whole thing is built. And so it was exposed a little bit. You know, companies said, why are we spending $20 million to sponsor a race car? Are we really getting a return on investment? So that happened. You know, there are also racetracks and race teams. They created a generation of salespeople that didn't have to really sell. They didn't know how to sell because the phone just rang all day. They just took orders. And so when the phone quit ringing, they didn't really know how to go out and drum up business and how to raise funds. And so I think that was part of it, too. And I really believe, too, you know, I know people bang on millennials all the time, but the reality is if a movie is longer than 2.5 hours, people just flip out. This is too long. I'm in here to this is crazy. What are we doing? And every single race weekend lasts 3, sometimes 4 days. And every single cup race lasts 4 hours. You know, everything in the season starts in the middle of February, and it starts at Valentine's and it ends at Thanksgiving. Everything's too long. You know, and one thing we do know about millennials, and I think this applies to me too, is that you can't sit through but so much, and so attention spans just aren't what they are. So it's a really complicated equation, but the reality is that, you know, they need to look at doing some things, and they've just got to be gutsy enough to take some big swings.
I got one more 2-part question here in racing. Number one, on the topic you just talked about, are they kind of in the same boat as Major League Baseball where they need to develop more personalities, more electricity with the drivers themselves? How do you see that? And then my follow-up question is, I understand that you had an interesting flight in 2009 with Richard Petty from the Coca-Cola 600 to the Indy 500 and back. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I answer the first part first, which is, I think that they're absolutely, and like baseball, the personalities are there. It's just a matter of letting those guys be there's players that rub guys the wrong way with bat flips and funky rooster haircuts and all this other stuff. But the reality is, I think they could go a long way with young people. Listen, my daughter grew up, was born and raised, and has lived in the Carolinas her whole life. Loves Mike Trout. I mean, loves him. And she loves him because we went and saw him play one time when she was a little girl. Baseball should do a better job of promoting that guy. Baseball should do a better job of promoting their new, home run derby champion. I mean, those guys need to be promoted. And listen, NASCAR is the same way. There are so many. Listen, Jimmy Johnson is the all-time greatest example of this. Jimmy Johnson is the least boring person that I know. He's a wild man, and no one knows that. And the reason is because he's just kind of whitewashed, whether it's sponsors or whether it's NASCAR itself or whether it's Hendrick Motorsports or whatever. They've never really let him be publicly the person that I know he is privately. And he's one of the finest people I know. He's a great father, but he also is a freaking wild man. And that should be out there a little bit. Chase Elliott, same way. But no one would know that at home because by the time he goes through all the filters, sponsors and whoever, he comes off as boring. So, yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. 2009 with Richard Petty, that might have been the most fun I've ever had at work in my life. There was STP was sponsoring a car with Richard Petty's 43 on it in the Petty Blue. John Andretti, who had driven for Richard Petty in NASCAR, he was driving the car. This was in the Indy 500. And, of course, Richard Petty owns his 43 car, famous 43 car in NASCAR. And we did the double. We met at the Charlotte Motor Speedway at dawn the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend, and we flew to Indianapolis, landed at the racetrack, landed at the airport, got on a helicopter, flew in a helicopter, landed on the backstretch. There was a golf course there at IMS, and we landed, and there were golf carts waiting to take us in. And, yeah, we went in and stayed halfway through the race and got back on the helicopter and went back to Charlotte. So I got to hang out with Richard Petty all day. I was a huge fan growing up. But the story I always tell is we landed at the Speedway, and there's two golf carts. And the King looks at me, and he goes, well, you need to get your credentials so you can get into the garage. I go, right. He goes, all right. He said, that golf cart will take you to the credential office. I go, great. And then he takes his finger, and he points directly into his own face. And he goes, I have my credentials with me, so I don't need to go to the credential office. And he jumped on his golf cart and took off the other way. So, yeah, that was the King was my guy when I was a kid. And so to have a friendship with him now is one of the most surreal experiences, as you guys can imagine.
Yeah, the all-time legend, without a doubt.
Yeah, that is really cool. I mean, growing up going to the races, the King and Dale Earnhardt that was who my dad. That's all he talked about. I was one of the ones that hopped on the Jeff Gordon bandwagon. I was a Rainbow Warrior when he started winning. So those are definitely some cool stories. While we got you on the horn, though, I've got to ask you about something. So you were talking about Marty Smith and the radio show and everything, and I think there's a reason why you guys are getting more airtime and everything, because it's really good. The radio show is awesome, the podcast, everything. I love listening to you guys. But I've got to ask you about something, the hillbilly headlines and the hillbillyisms and all that. So, I mean, we're from Michigan. You go to northern Michigan, you get to there's some hillbilly areas. There's some redneck areas. It's not necessarily the South.
I mean, we say all the time that I always tell the story. When I moved to Connecticut, I moved to Bristol, Connecticut right out of college. And I remember calling my father as I was driving around in like Southington or Farmington or one of those towns there in Connecticut. I called my dad and I go, man, there are rednecks everywhere. and it's a fact. And when we do hillbilly headlines on Saturday mornings, there's no question that the state of Florida dominates the hillbilly headlines, and no one should be surprised by that. But Florida is this quilt work of people from all over the country. No one's from Florida. They moved to Florida from New England, from the Midwest, from Arizona, from everywhere. But what we have learned is there are hillbillies and rednecks everywhere. We've had hillbilly headlines from Brazil, from Germany. We had a guy in Australia the other day that burned down his entire neighborhood because he was trying to kill like a squirrel with a blowtorch. I mean, these are the things that we get them from all over the world. So it's you're absolutely right. We have learned, we educate the world on that fact that there are hillbillies everywhere.
Well, I know you're running short on time, and, man, do we appreciate the time you've given us. But I got another follow-up question in a different sport, if you don't mind, Ryan.
Sure.
I know your second book was The Road to Omaha, Hits, Hopes, and History of the College World Series. I happened to catch you just by accident. It was a rain delay this year, and there was a documentary about the 1996 championship game between LSU and Miami. Now, can you paint the picture of that natural moment, if you will, of that final World Series game?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it was the greatest moment in the history of the College World Series, and it will always be the greatest moment in the history of the College World Series. And a guy named Warren Morris, who was a local kid from Louisiana, was a great high school ball player, but got no scholarship offers, walked on at LSU, backed up Todd Walker, who I work with now at SEC Network, and Todd, of course, played in the big leagues forever, one of the greatest hitters in the history of college baseball. And poor Warren finally was going to be the second baseman, and he broke his hand at the start of the year and missed the entire season, and then came back just in time for the College World Series and was terrible. He was awful. And Miami at this time, this was a roster that was just packed with future big leaguers, and LSU was really good. And this was kind of the showdown to figure out who was going to be, the team of the decade of the 90s. And poor Warren Morris ends up at the plate with 2 outs in the bottom of the last inning, and his poor mother was sitting in Alexandria, Louisiana, with her head in her hands going, oh, my God, this is how my son's career is going to end, is striking out at the end of the College World Series with a hurt hand. And Warren always says, I talked to him just a couple months ago, he always says that he felt terrible all year, and the first time he felt good in the batting cage was that morning. And he got a pitch he could drive, and he just kind of flicked it over the corner in the right-hand side of the fence at Rosenblatt Stadium, which was, I said Indianapolis was my favorite sporting venue in the world. And the only reason I didn't say Rosenblatt is because Rosenblatt's gone. But what a great place and what a great moment. And, I always know when it's raining at the College World Series because my phone starts blowing up, and it's my friends, because every time it rains, what they use for rainfill is to show the Warren Morris documentary.
Which you were a part of.
Even if I'm not watching, I know it's raining in Omaha when my friends are going, hey, you're on TV talking about Warren Morris.
Well, that's awesome, man. And I know, working here, rain delays during college baseball, that's something that I've come to. There's a love-hate relationship with rain delays.
Yeah, well, and Omaha, and listen, and the College World Series is so incredible, and it's so amazing to go cover, but you're there for 2 weeks. And, late afternoon thunderstorms, I don't have to tell you guys, especially in the Midwest, it's every afternoon. And so those two-day games, or 2 game days in particular, you're almost always going to hit it. But, yeah, my friends that all worked in the press box, Kyle Peterson and those guys, they always say by the end of the College World Series they hate my guts because they've only done like 2 or 3 documentaries about college baseball, and I'm in all of them. So anytime they – and they play them in the stadium. So anytime they said everybody's raining, everybody in Omaha hates me by the end of the 2 weeks because they're tired of looking at me.
So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, I think what we're all just kind of waiting for to start, which is college football season.
Yeah.
And kind of the big headline this week has been the whole Urban Meyer scenario. So how do you see that playing out? Do you think he'll be able to keep his job, or do you think that he's going to be gone before the season starts?
Well, my initial reaction was that he was going to be gone. Mm-hmm. But as the longer this thing has stretched on, the more I've realized he's going to be back. And once the investigation committee announced very specifically, we have 14 days to do our investigation, which is just weird.
Yeah. Why do you think they did that?
I just think they know they've got to do whatever they're going to do before the season starts.
Okay.
And so if you go in and put a deadline on it, then, I don't know. But just it was a week ago when they started that Friday after the news broke that our buddy Brett McMurphy wrote out there, and once that Friday afternoon, right at 5 o'clock when everyone's getting off of work, right when that hit, that and by the way, the AD knew too. That's when I realized, okay, this is a coordinated effort. They're rolling over on the athletic director now, and they're going to do what they can to save Urban Meyer. Listen, you guys know this. In the end, follow the money.
Yeah.
And if the 2 biggest boosters at Ohio State are the guy that owns Bed Bath & Beyond at Victoria's Secret, who's a billionaire, and then Jimmy Haslam that owns the Cleveland Browns. And if those 2 guys call and say, he's got to go, he's gone. But if those 2 guys call and say, you know what, we really probably need to keep him around, then they put their lawyers on and they figure something out. So, follow the money on those deals. He might not coach the first few weeks, but by the time we hit October and the games really start mattering, I got a pretty good feeling that Urban Meyer's going to be on the sideline.
So in that same regard, so let me ask you this. This is something I'm honestly not sure how I feel about. Do you think it's the coach's job to sort of act as like a moral compass for like the entire university, or do you think it's just his job to, coach his players? And win
I think you're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you were the CEO at IBM or the CEO at Geico or the CEO at wherever, if you were the CEO of your local home security system company on the corner, it's your responsibility what the people underneath you do. It is. And if you're going to be, I say this all the time. I'm talking about race car drivers. I've had this conversation with drivers before, which is they complain because their divorce is in the paper, or they complain because people are asking about things. And I'm like, listen, you can't take the big paycheck, and you can't star in TV commercials, and you can't be on billboards and then get your feelings hurt if the public wants to hold you to a higher standard. And if you're the CEO of a one of the state of Ohio's biggest corporations is Ohio State football. And if you're the CEO of that, and that's what Urban Meyer is, and oh, by the way, you also have kind of put yourself out there over the years as the moral compass, which he has done, then you have to be prepared to take the darts when the time comes, and I don't believe that he is.
I have one final football question for you, and we'll get ready to let you go. Your alma mater, you went to Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
What did you think about the whole Schiano situation and where they stand now?
Well, I think that the Tennessee fan base did not distinguish itself. I think that, and these are my people. I mean, listen, I'm an alum. I'm married into it. I'm married a Knoxville girl. Between my roommates and my in-laws, every time I speak out on this, I get nasty personal text messages. But the reality is that the fan base they have a reputation now. They just do. And it's not everybody, but it certainly were the people that were making the most noise. And, it was everything short of grabbing pitchforks and tar and feathering somebody. It just was. And it was the kind of thing that they weren't doing in Knoxville not that long ago, and now it seems pretty routine. So I like Schiano fine. I don't know if he was the right hire or not. I think the athletic director was doomed regardless. But the Tennessee fan base did not do itself any favors, and still won't let it go. Like even now with the Urban Meyer thing, almost immediately there was a group of very loud Tennessee fans that were turning this into, well, Schiano's one of his guys, so we just, he probably knew about this too. It's like, just let it go. You got a new head coach, just move on. But they just kind of crave the soap opera in Knoxville, and sometimes you're just willing to create one even when there wasn't one.
Well, I know you're on the clock, Ryan. It's just an outstanding appearance. We really appreciate it. Matt, you got anything else you want to add?
No, man, just appreciate you taking the time out. I know you got a busy schedule, so yeah, we definitely appreciate it.
Hey, I appreciate everything you do, and I will see you down at the office.
Well, boys, that was awesome. Ryan McGee, a great 25 minutes or so. We're definitely going to book him on the show again for sure. That was fun.
8590, 9500. Looking for items to buy or sell? Look no further than SheridanAuctionService.com. We will solve your problem. Bring Sheridan Realty and auction your items, and we will market them all over the country and get them sold. If you are looking to buy items, we can help with that too. Call today, 989-720-SELL. It's fast, easy, and we get results. SheridanAuctionService.com. Buy or sell, we'll get it done for you. Call 989-720-SELL. You'll do better with Sheridan.